My name's Troy, and I never thought I'd be that guy posting on Reddit about family drama. But after what happened this summer, I honestly don't know how else to process it. It's one of those things that starts small, little comments, little exclusions, and before you know it, you're sitting in your car with your wife in tears beside you, wondering how your own family could treat you like this. To set the scene, my parents, Greg and Lorna, own a family cabin by a lake about 2 hours from where I live. It's been in the family for years, passed down from my grandfather. Growing up, we spent every summer there, swimming, fishing, grilling marshmallows at night. It was the one place that always felt peaceful. Or, at least, it used to. Everything started shifting about 2 years ago when my older brother, Eric, got divorced. He and his 2 kids started spending every free weekend at the cabin. My parents, especially my mom, were thrilled. She always had a soft spot for Eric, the responsible one. According to her, he could do no wrong, even when he was clearly the one causing the problem. Meanwhile, I had gotten married to my wife, Jenna, around the same time. Jenna's amazing, kind, grounded, and the type of person who tries to make everyone feel comfortable. She really tried with my family. She baked for holidays, sent thoughtful gifts, remembered birthdays, all that. But no matter what she did, my mom acted like she was intruding. When we first got married, my mom actually told me, "It'll take me time to get used to sharing you, Troy." That comment stuck with me. Sharing me? Like I was some sort of possession. Anyway, every summer, my parents organize what they call the Family Cabin Week. It's supposed to be for everyone. Me, Eric, my parents, and our families. We rotate who gets which room. Everyone pitches in for groceries, and it's usually a nice break. But this year, things started off weird. A few weeks before the trip, I called my mom to confirm our dates. I wanted to make sure I'd booked the time off work, and I figured we could bring extra supplies since Jenna likes to cook big meals for everyone. When I mentioned that, my mom went quiet for a second, then said, "Oh, sweetie, about that. We actually weren't sure if you two were coming this year." I remember blinking, thinking I must have misheard her. "What do you mean? We always come." "Well," she started, in that tone she uses when she's pretending to be gentle but really isn't. "Eric and the kids are going up earlier this year, and they'll be using the main cabin. We just thought maybe Jenna wouldn't feel very comfortable with all the chaos. You know how loud the kids get." That was her excuse. That Jenna wouldn't feel comfortable. I tried to stay calm. "Mom, we're fine with the kids. We've shared the space before. Why didn't anyone tell me earlier?" "It just worked out this way," she said quickly. "Don't make a big deal out of it. You can always come another time." I hung up, pretending I wasn't as hurt as I was. When I told Jenna, she looked down and said quietly, "I told you they didn't like me." That hit hard. 2 days later, my mom posted a bunch of photos on Facebook, Eric, the kids, and my parents sitting around the campfire at our family cabin, smiling. Marshmallows. The same fire pit where Jenna and I had made s'mores the year before. No invite. No message. Nothing. I didn't comment, but I saw that my dad's account, one he shares with my mom, was being used to manage cabin rentals. They rent out parts of the property to tourists on weekends to cover maintenance costs. That same night, while Jenna was asleep beside me, I sat staring at the screen, scrolling through booking after booking. I'd helped Dad set up the system years ago. I still knew the passwords. That's when a thought crossed my mind. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was more about fairness. They were excluding us from a place that was supposed to belong to everyone. So I logged in. And when I saw the names of the people renting for the rest of the month, bookings under Eric's name, family friends, even one listed as Lorna's guest, something inside me just snapped. I stared at the cancel booking button for a long time before clicking it. One, then another, then another. Every single rental gone. Each one triggered an automatic refund. And because the PayPal account was still connected to my card from when I helped my dad set it up 3 years ago, the money flowed straight back to me. At first, it didn't even feel real. I just sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, wondering if I'd gone too far. But then I saw another post, this time a story from Eric's account, of everyone at the lake again, captioned, "Family time, the best time." That did it. 10 minutes later, my phone started buzzing. Over and over. "Eric." When I finally answered, he didn't even let me speak. "You just ruined everything," he shouted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I leaned back in my chair, trying to sound calm. "I fixed it," I said. The cabin's supposed to be for everyone, remember? He went silent for a few seconds before saying, "You're unbelievable. Mom and Dad are furious. You think this makes you look good. I think it makes things fair," I replied. There was another pause. Then he said in this low, angry voice, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." And before I could say anything else, he hung up. When I woke up the next morning, I honestly thought maybe the whole thing had been a dream. The sun was streaming through the curtains. The air smelled faintly of coffee. Jenna must have already started a pot. And for a second, everything felt peaceful again. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. "Mom, we need to talk. I'm on my way." No greeting, no explanation. Just that. I stared at it for a long time, feeling my stomach tighten. My mom has always had a way of turning any situation around to make herself the victim. Whenever there was conflict, she'd show up uninvited, act like she was trying to make peace. And by the end of it, I'd be the one apologizing. It was a pattern that had repeated itself my whole life, and every time, I promised myself it'd be the last. Jenna came out of the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee. She must have seen my expression because she set them down slowly and asked, "What happened?" I showed her the message. She didn't say anything at first, just sighed, rubbing her temples. "She's really coming here?" I nodded. "Apparently. Do you want me to stay?" she asked softly. "Of course I do," I said. "This involves both of us." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay, then I'll be right here." We sat together on the couch, sipping our coffee in silence, the tension thick in the room. It didn't take long for the familiar sound of my mom's old silver sedan to pull into the driveway. Through the window, I watched her step out, wearing a pressed floral blouse and that same expression she always wore before a confrontation. Tight smile, chin high, as if she were already preparing her lines for the argument. The knock came sharp and quick. When I opened the door, she didn't even wait for an invitation. She brushed past me with her purse tucked tightly under her arm, glancing around like she was taking inventory of our living room. "So this is where all that cabin refund money went," she said, half joking, but not really. "Good morning to you too," I replied, shutting the door. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and gave Jenna a brief, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jenna, dear, I wasn't expecting to see you this early." Jenna, calm as ever, said, "It's our house. Why wouldn't I be here?" That made my mom purse her lips. "Of course. I just meant, well, never mind. Let's talk about what happened, Troy." I sat across from her, bracing myself. "You mean the bookings?" "Yes, the bookings." Her tone sharpened immediately. "Your father and I had everything organized. The rental income was helping cover the property taxes, and you went behind our backs and canceled every single one. People were furious. Your brother had guests coming this weekend." I leaned forward slightly. "Guests he didn't even ask me about. Guests staying in a cabin that belongs to the whole family." "It's not that simple," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Eric has been handling most of the upkeep. He's there all the time. You hardly go anymore, and when you do, it feels different. You and Jenna don't really fit in with how things are now." There it was again. "You don't fit in." I felt my jaw tighten. "Different how?" My mom hesitated. "Jenna's just particular. She doesn't like the noise, or the bugs, or the way we do things. I don't want her feeling uncomfortable." Before I could respond, Jenna spoke up. Her voice was steady, but there was a quiet hurt underneath it. "Lorna, I've never said that. I actually like going there. I always helped cook and clean, and I never complained." My mom gave her a tight smile. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that, dear. It's just, some people aren't used to that kind of rustic lifestyle." I could see Jenna's shoulders stiffen. That's how my mom worked. Every insult wrapped in politeness. Every criticism disguised as concern. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "This isn't about Jenna or bugs or anything else. It's about being left out. You told me the cabin was for everyone. Then you took that back because Eric wanted it all to himself." "It's not about taking it back," she said quickly. "It's about practicality. You live far away. You don't use it much. Eric does. Why shouldn't the person who actually takes care of it have a little priority?" I leaned back, shaking my head slowly. "Because that's not how family works. Grandpa left that place for all of us, not just for whoever shows up the most." For a moment, my mom's confident posture faltered. Then she crossed her arms and said, "Well, you can thank your little stunt for making things much harder on us." The rental money was going toward fixing the roof. You've just cost us thousands. I didn't cost you anything, I said quietly. I just reminded you whose names are on the deed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You went through Dad's account, didn't you? Without asking. I set that account up for him, I said. And yes, it's still linked to my card. I didn't steal anything. I just reclaimed what's partly mine. For a few seconds, she didn't speak. The room felt heavy, like the air had thickened. Then she stood up slowly and adjusted her purse strap. I hope you realize what you've started, Troy, she said. You think this is about fairness, but all you've done is drive a wedge through this family. The wedge was already there, I replied. Her expression hardened. Eric was right. You've changed. She turned to leave, but Jenna's voice stopped her at the door. Lorna, she said softly. You know what hurts the most? We didn't even get a call. Not one. You could have told us the truth, that you wanted Eric to have the cabin for himself. But instead, you lied to make it sound like you were protecting my feelings. My mom didn't turn around. I was protecting what's left of this family, she said coldly. Then she walked out, closing the door behind her with a soft but deliberate click. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jenna sank onto the couch, running her hands over her face. She's never going to admit she's wrong, is she? No, I said. She never does. I walked to the window and watched her car pull away. My chest felt tight, but beneath the hurt, something else was building, resolve. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I went to work, kept my head down, and tried to focus. But that tension lingered, like the calm before a storm. Then, on Thursday evening, I got an email. It was from the rental platform, notifying me that someone had tried to change the payment method on the cabin's account. The name listed? Eric Matthews. I sat staring at the screen, my heart thudding. They were trying to lock me out. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Dad. Dad, your mom says there's been a misunderstanding. Let's talk this weekend at the cabin. Just us. No, Jenna. I read it twice. Then again. No, Jenna. The message might as well have said everything they truly thought. When Jenna came into the room and saw my expression, she asked quietly, "What did they say?" I showed her the text. She stared at it for a long time before whispering, "You're not going alone, are you?" I hesitated. "I don't want you getting dragged into this any deeper." "Troy, it already involves me," she said. "They've made that clear." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about how my family had twisted something that used to be beautiful into a battlefield. I remembered the laughter from years ago, the late nights fishing with my dad, the smell of pine, the sound of my mom humming while cooking breakfast on the porch. Now it all felt tainted. But a part of me still wanted to hear what Dad had to say. He'd been quiet through most of this. Too quiet. If anyone could make sense of it, maybe it was him. So the next morning, I packed a small bag and drove to the cabin. The road felt longer than usual, the trees darker, the air heavier. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, Eric's truck was already there. And standing beside it, arms crossed, was my brother. He wasn't smiling. "Took you long enough," he said as I stepped out of the car. I looked past him toward the cabin, where I saw my parents standing on the porch together. My mom's expression was unreadable. My dad looked tired. Eric took a step closer. "You think you're clever, huh? You embarrassed us. You ruined everything we worked for." I didn't answer. I just walked past him toward the porch. My dad sighed heavily when he saw me. "Troy, I wish you hadn't done what you did. I wish you hadn't let this get so far," I said quietly. We stood there for a moment, no one speaking. The lake shimmered behind them, calm and blue. But in that stillness, I could feel the storm building, an argument that had been years in the making, about loyalty, money, and the illusion of family fairness. My mom was the one who broke the silence. "Well," she said, her voice firm and final, "since you've made it clear you don't respect this family anymore, we've made a decision." I looked at her warily. "What decision?" Eric smirked slightly. "We're changing the ownership arrangement." I stood there on the porch, the boards creaking faintly under my shoes, feeling the weight of what my mom had just said sink in. Changing the ownership arrangement. Those 4 words hit harder than I expected. My father avoided my eyes, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. My mom stood tall beside him, chin lifted, like she was about to deliver a speech she'd rehearsed 100 times. "What do you mean, changing it?" I asked carefully. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. My mom clasped her hands together. "Your father and I have been talking," she began. and we realized that the current setup isn't fair. The cabin has become a financial burden, and it's really Eric who's been taking care of everything: repairs, cleaning, the rental management. It doesn't make sense for you to still have an equal share when you barely contribute. There it was. The real motive, dressed up in logic and reason. I felt my jaw tighten. Barely contribute? Mom, I helped replace the dock 2 summers ago. I paid for the new water pump. I set up the rental system that's been bringing in money every month. She waved a dismissive hand, as if all of that were irrelevant. You helped once or twice, dear. But you have to admit, you're not as involved as Eric. Eric smirked slightly, leaning against the railing. It's just reality, Troy. You've got your own life now. We're not trying to cut you out, but we need something that reflects how things really are. I turned to my father. And you agree with this? He sighed deeply, still not meeting my gaze. Your mother makes some valid points. The taxes have gone up, and if Eric is doing most of the work, maybe it's time to adjust things. We were thinking we could buy out your share, just to simplify ownership. It'll be easier for everyone. I stared at them, disbelief rising in my chest. Buy out my share? With what money? The money I just refunded from my card. My mom stiffened. That money was for maintenance, not your personal use. You had no right to touch it. I had every right, I said firmly. You left my name on the account for a reason. If you didn't want me involved, you should have removed me years ago. My dad finally looked at me, his expression tired but stern. You're making this harder than it has to be, son. We're offering a fair deal. Take the payout. Let Eric handle things from now on. It's not about sides. It's about practicality. Practicality, I repeated slowly. Right. There was a long silence. The only sound was the soft lap of water against the shore. My hands were shaking slightly, though not from fear, more from anger that I was trying hard to keep contained. You really think I'm just going to walk away? I said. That you can erase me from this like I was never part of it? My mom crossed her arms. No one is erasing you. We're just moving forward in a way that makes sense. You've changed, Troy. Ever since you married Jenna, you've been distant. You don't call, you don't visit. I cut her off. Mom, I stopped visiting because you made Jenna feel unwelcome every single time. You didn't want her here. You didn't even invite us this summer. And now you're pretending this is about taxes. Eric stepped forward. You're twisting things. Mom and Dad have always tried to include you, but you've been acting like we're out to get you. Maybe if you hadn't overreacted and canceled the rentals, we wouldn't be here. I turned to him. You mean the rentals you put under your name? The ones that were never discussed with me or Dad? Yeah, Eric, that's real family teamwork. He took a step closer, his expression darkening. You're lucky Mom and Dad are even offering you a payout. If it were up to me, I'd tell you to forget it altogether. That's enough, my dad said sharply. But Eric just shrugged, his tone dripping with false calm. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. My mom sighed, pretending to sound weary and reasonable. Let's not make this ugly. Troy, you've always been so sensitive about fairness. So here's your chance to be practical. Take the offer, move on, and we can all start fresh. I looked at each of them in turn. My father's tired resignation, my mother's cold certainty, Eric's smug half-smile. It all hit me like a punch to the gut. They really thought I'd give up that easily. What if I don't agree? I asked quietly. My mom gave a little sigh, the kind she used to give when I was a teenager refusing to follow her rules. Then I suppose we'll have to take the next step. We've already spoken to a lawyer about possible restructuring. I felt my pulse quicken. You what? My dad raised his hands in a half-hearted gesture. It's not finalized, Troy. We just wanted to know what our options were. Options, I repeated, meaning how to push me out legally. No one answered. That silence told me everything I needed to know. For a long moment, none of us spoke. I stared out toward the lake, the same lake where I'd learned to swim, where Dad had taught me how to bait a hook, where we'd spent countless evenings sitting on the dock talking about nothing and everything. Now it all felt hollow. Finally, I said, fine. If you want to make this about paperwork, then so be it. But you'd better check the documents before you go to that lawyer. My mom frowned. What's that supposed to mean? I met her gaze. It means the deed isn't as simple as you think. Her expression shifted slightly, but before she could respond, I turned toward my car. You've made your intentions clear. I'll be in touch. Troy, my dad called out, his voice uncertain. Don't make this worse than it is. I stopped and looked back. It's already worse than it ever should have been. Then I got in my car and drove off. The ride home felt endless. My mind replayed every word, every glance, every tiny detail. They had planned this, carefully, quietly, believing I'd just comply. But the thing they'd forgotten was that Grandpa's original ownership document wasn't the same as the one they'd been using for years. When Grandpa passed away, he left the cabin to all of us jointly. However, before it was transferred into my parents' names, I had helped with some legal paperwork, back when I was studying business and still working at a law firm as an assistant. My father had asked me to handle the registration process. At the time, none of us realized how significant that would become. That's when I remembered something. A clause in the ownership agreement that I had insisted on adding. One that required unanimous consent from all heirs before any changes could be made to the property or its ownership. It had been my idea after hearing stories of families torn apart by exactly this kind of dispute. My parents hadn't objected then. They probably didn't even remember. But I did. When I got home, Jenna was waiting on the porch. She could tell just by my face that things hadn't gone well. "What happened?" she asked quietly. I told her everything. The proposal to buy me out, the talk about lawyers, the threat to change ownership. As I spoke, her expression went from disbelief to sadness, then finally to quiet resolve. "So they really mean to cut you out," she said softly. "They think they can," I replied. "But they can't. Not without me signing off." Jenna nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time they learn that." That night, I went through my old files. Sure enough, buried in an old folder, I found a scanned copy of the original deed and the notarized agreement. The clause was still there, clear as day. No changes to ownership without all parties' written consent. I stared at that line for a long time, feeling both angry and vindicated. They thought they had all the power. They didn't realize they'd built their plan on a foundation they couldn't touch. Still, I didn't rush into anything. I knew how my family operated. They thrived on drama, on playing the victim. If I struck too soon, they'd twist the narrative. I had to be smart, patient, and calm. The next few days were quiet, but I could sense the tension building. Eric sent me a few vague messages. Nothing directly threatening, just things like, "You're making this harder than it needs to be," and "You could still fix this if you want it." Then one evening, my father called. His tone was subdued, almost weary. "Son, can we talk?" he asked. "About what?" I said, though I already knew. "About the cabin," he said. "Your mother's really upset. We don't want this to turn into something ugly. Maybe you can come over tomorrow night? We'll all sit down together. No yelling, no accusations." I hesitated. "Will Eric be there?" "Yes," he said softly. "But I'll make sure things stay civil." Civil, that was never a word that lasted long in my family. Still, part of me wanted to face them again, if only to make it clear that I wasn't backing down. So I agreed. As I hung up, Jenna touched my arm. "You're sure about this?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "Because I think it's time they heard the truth." I told them I'd come to the meeting because I wanted to be reasonable. That was a lie. I wanted to be strategic. After I got home and found the deed clause, I slept about 2 hours total that night. Not because I was anxious about a legal fight, though that was possible, but because every element of my childhood that my parents had slowly turned into a commodity felt suddenly reclaimable. That cabin had been a refuge. They'd turned it into a ledger. The next morning, I started quietly. First, I made copies, high-quality scans, of every document I could find. The original deed, the notarized unanimous consent clause, the receipts for every repair I'd paid for, emails where Dad thanked me for setting up the rental account, even the messages where Mom had said, in her typical passive voice, that Eric helps so much with the cabin. Little things. Paper trails. Facts. Then I called someone I knew would be useful. Mara, an old family friend who runs a local bed and breakfast and knows every municipal code and neighbor in a 30-mile radius. Mara owes me a favor from when I helped her get a permit for a renovation. She picked up on the first ring. "Troy," she said, surprised. "Everything okay? Your mom called." She sounded off. "That's why I'm calling you," I said. I kept my voice light, like it was nothing. "I need to put a stop to something before it becomes a bigger story. Can you come up to the cabin this weekend? Bring a copy of the town's easement and any paperwork you have on historic properties. Also, be casual. Can you bring Benny from the hardware store? He knows the roof history." She hesitated, then laughed. "Only you would ask for Benny for moral support." "Yeah, I'll come. Want me to bring pie?" I smiled, even though she couldn't see me. "Bring the pie." Hearing the word pie, made it all feel strangely ordinary, which was helpful. Revenge, I decided, didn't have to be theatrical. It should be effective, and it should make them look like what they were: petty, entitled, and hypocritical. Over the next 48 hours, I moved like someone executing a quiet, domestic campaign. I texted my uncle, Dad's brother, who'd always been skeptical of how Mom favored Eric. He promised to come to the meeting as moral support. I messaged a few cousins I knew would show up for family drama. They didn't ask for details, just a time and a promise of coffee. I called Tom, the town notary who'd helped me pull signatures on some paperwork a few years back. He agreed to stop by and witness anything we needed. I also messaged two neighbors, people who knew the cabin's history and would corroborate anything about the rental disturbances. Most importantly, I quietly reinstated a few weekend bookings on the rental platform, but not for strangers. I booked them under names of family friends who supported me, and I set them for the weekend Mom and Eric had been planning to have the cabin to themselves. The platform emails went to the account Dad and Mom shared, but the bookings were non-refundable and confirmed. That would buy me time, or at least anxiety. Jenna was my co-conspirator from the start, whether she liked it or not. She didn't go for loud theatrics. Her revenge style was kitchen sans violence. She planned food, logistics, and optics. If you want people on your side, she said, make it look warm. Make it look like they're the ones being dramatic. She arranged for her sister, who's a quietly persuasive teacher, to bring a stack of home-baked muffins and to sit between Dad and Mom in a way that would make confrontation look ridiculous. She printed out copies of the deed and slid them into a neat folder labeled Family Documents. The folder seemed small and calm, the exact opposite of the chaos brewing behind it. When the day of the meeting came, I drove up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my college debate team days. The sky was clear, the lake was glassy, and the air smelled like cut grass and diesel from the boat motors, normal things that used to soothe me. They no longer did. I pulled into the driveway and noticed Eric's truck already there, as expected. Dad's pickup was next to it, but there were a surprising number of other cars scattered along the gravel, a few that weren't ours. I parked, trying not to look too surprised. As I walked toward the porch, I saw my Aunt June standing by the rail, her arms folded but her mouth a small, tight line of solidarity. Beside her, Tom the notary was fiddling with his phone. Mara walked up behind them carrying a pie tin and a thermos. My mom looked ready for battle. She had her practiced neutral face on, the one she uses when she thinks she's being magnanimous. Dad's jaw was set in a way I'd never seen it before, like he had sand in his teeth. They greeted me with the clipped civility of people about to perform a ritual. But when Mom noticed the extra cars, her eyes flicked once toward the line of people and then to me. That was the moment gratitude and fury collided in her expression. She blinked fast, and for a second I caught a look of something like fear. Good, she said. Seems you brought company. Family, I said, and a few friends. I handed Dad the folder with the deeds. He took it with a puzzled look. We sat down on the porch, the usual wide semicircle of mismatched chairs. Jenna and her sister took a seat together, the muffins between them. I sat opposite my parents, and the mood felt heavy and taut. My mom started, voice polished and measured. We asked you to come because we thought, well, to try and resolve things. We don't want this to turn into a spectacle. I smiled, slow and calm. Neither do I. That's why I invited Tom. I gestured. Tom stood and placed a small leather case on the table, the notary's stamp peeking out. There's something important we need to make clear before any talk of lawyers or buyouts happens. Dad sighed. Troy, we were trying to give you a fair offer. We wanted to avoid court. A fair offer from the people who tried to lock me out. I asked. I don't see how that's fair. My mom's eyes narrowed. Enough. Don't make this personal. You canceled our bookings. How was I supposed to explain that to paying guests? You explained it by posting photos, I said calmly. You didn't call us. You didn't send a text. You put up a smiling family photo on Facebook like none of this was happening. You decided for us. Murmurs ran around the porch. Aunt June let out a small, displeased sound. A neighbor cleared his throat. I could feel the balance shifting. I asked Tom to open my folder. With a steady hand, he spread out the deed and pointed to the clause about unanimous consent. He read it aloud, formally. No transfers, changes of ownership, or sale shall be effected without the written and notarized consent of all named heirs. Mom's face went white for a sliver of a second. Then she smiled, that practiced armor, and tried to take it in stride. I wasn't aware of that clause, she said too slowly. If it exists, of course we'll respect it. Of course, I said. We should also respect the spirit. I tapped the folder. Grandpa left that place for all of us. He wanted it to be the thing that kept us together. That means usage, care, and decisions require all of us. Someone in the back, my cousin Marla, who'd always been sensitive to fairness, spoke up. You can't just decide to privatize it because your kid acts as property manager. That's not how family works. Eric jabbed a finger toward me. You're playing a game. You canceled bookings and refunded people. That cost us. So, I said slowly, tell me which of those people you think I personally hurt. The strangers who booked? The guests who were turned away? Or the family who thought they could manipulate a generational gift? My dad's shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked small. We were trying to do what we thought was best, he began. Best for whom? I asked. Because it wasn't best for everyone. At that, Mom's patience snapped. She rose from her chair in a carefully controlled movement. Are you really going to make this about moral high ground, Troy? After what you did, you humiliated us. You embarrassed your brother. I didn't embarrass anyone, I said quietly. I made the cabin available to those who love it. I gave people a place to come who weren't complicit in excluding my wife and me. That's when Jenna stood. She was usually quiet in family fights. She hates being the spectacle. But something in her voice had steel. You left us out. You didn't even call. You sat around a fire at a place you know means something to me and my husband and pretended everything was fine. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice. I saw the color drain from Mom's face. For the first time all week, she looked startled, real human startled, not stage managed. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for a phrase that could put this back into her favor. While she fumbled, my Aunt June, who'd been quiet until now, went to the car and came back with a handful of printed emails and screenshots. She tossed them onto the table like a gavel. The messages were small. My mom confirming bookings under Eric's name, volunteers discussing exclusive weekend plans, a forwarded message from a neighbor who'd been asked to keep quiet about the family's private weekend. The porch turned into something like a courtroom. People who'd been peripheral now gave firm nods. Tom the notary took a seat and watched like someone presiding over a civil ceremony that had gone sideways. Eric tried to bluff, a practiced look, but he was losing the room. This is ridiculous. We were just trying to keep things simple. We didn't mean to be cruel. You were cruel by omission, I said. That matters. He sputtered, and in that sputter was the kernel of a deeper confession. He'd wanted the cabin to be his base of operations, his place to build influence, to host friends, to keep the business of his life humming without the inconvenience of dissenting family voices. He had turned the cabin into a tool. At that point, the dynamic shifted from legal to moral, and morality is a dangerous place for manipulators. People who'd come expecting a quiet, private meeting found themselves faced with pattern and proof. The neighbors who'd been corralled into silence sat up straighter. Uncle Greg, Dad's brother, spoke in a low voice about fairness and the memory of Grandpa spending summers teaching kids to fish. My father's eyes finally found mine. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. Troy, he said, voice small. We don't want to fight. I don't either, I said. I want everyone to enjoy what Grandpa left us. I want the cabin to be a place for family, not a ledger where the loudest gets the most. I want my wife to feel welcome. At the very least, we can agree to a usage schedule that allows everyone fair time. And if repairs or taxes are an issue, we handle them together. No unilateral decisions. No secret bookings under one name. Mom opened her mouth, closed it. Eric's jaw worked. For a moment, it looked like we might reach some forced, brittle compromise. But that's when Eric made the mistake. You think this little meeting is going to change things? He sneered, louder than anyone expected. You think your friends and your little folder and your notary will stop us? We can go to a lawyer tomorrow. We can start the paperwork. See how long that clause keeps you in. Silence fell. The people who'd backed me looked at Eric the way you look at a dog that's about to bite the hand that fed it. My dad's face went from tired to ashamed. I stood up slowly, feeling the place crank open inside me where resolve lived. If you want to go to a lawyer, I said, then go. But if you do, you'll be making this public. Eric laughed. Public? And what will the public care about? A family squabble. They'll care about hypocrisy, I said. They'll care about how you used a place Grandpa left to bring your friends and make a profit while excluding his own family. They'll care about the way you treat people who aren't convenient to you. And they'll care about the post you made showing you all so happy while you decided who gets to be family. I could see the blood drain from Mom's face. She realized what I was implying. There were messages, photos, a paper trail that, if presented to the community or even the rental site, would not make them look good. That's when my final piece of quiet revenge came together, the one I hadn't told anyone about. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the rental platform. I scrolled to the weekend Eric had hoped to monopolize and hit a button that would send an automatic confirmation to the renters I'd booked earlier. Then I opened my social media app and scheduled a post, carefully worded, calm, without malice, inviting extended family and neighbors to a family celebration, honoring Grandpa's cabin on the day Eric had been planning to be exclusive. The post included a photo of Grandpa, the deed clause, and a line about how family gifts aren't for privatization. I felt like a petty kingpin for a second. The bookings were non-refundable. The post sent notifications to a small circle of people who immediately responded with comments. How sorry they were to hear about the exclusion, how they'd love to come, how they remember Grandpa's kindness. The momentum built like small stones rolling into an avalanche. Mom's face went from pale to red to a strange, furious gray. She grabbed for her purse. "You'll regret this," she said, voice small but fierce. "Maybe," I said. "But regret isn't what I'm betting on. I'm betting on people choosing to be decent." There was a flurry of cars along the drive within the hour. My aunt's old station wagon, Mara's little B&B van, a neighbor with a trailer of kayaks. Someone had brought folding chairs. Someone else had printed out a faded picture of Grandpa with the caption, "For everyone." I could see neighbors offering to bring supplies. The porch filled with voices that weren't manipulation. They were warmth, genuine surprise, and quiet indignation. My parents stood on the porch, looking as if they'd been caught stealing from their own family. Eric's jaw clenched. He moved toward his truck, then stopped, as if reconsidering what storm he'd tried to conjure. I felt the old cabin settle around us like a judge. The air smelled of pine and the sugar of someone's famous coffee. I realized, with a cold little thrill, that I'd forced them to choose between two things: double down and make this legal and ugly, or step back and let everyone see the person they'd become. Before either of those choices could be made, a car turned into the drive. It wasn't one I recognized at first. A white sedan pulled up slow, and out stepped Mrs. Klein from down the lane. The woman who'd been Aunt June's closest friend, a woman who'd never been loud, but whose word in town carried weight. She looked at Mom, then at me, then she smiled the kind of smile that means she's on the side of truth. "That's enough talking," she said, voice soft and direct. "Let's make the pie table then. Everyone's hungry." Mom opened her mouth to protest, but the look around the yard, filled with people who showed up because dignity matters, turned protests into stage whispers. Eric muttered something under his breath and stalked toward the pier. Dad stood frozen, caught between his wife's fury and the small, swelling chorus of neighbors whose loyalty he'd forgotten to measure. I felt Jenna's hand find mine. "You did well," she whispered. "You did the right, quiet thing." I didn't have time to answer, because from the corner of my eye I saw Eric pull his phone out and start recording, his lips moving in a rapid, vicious whisper. He was calling someone or filming. Whatever it was, his expression was that of a man cornered enough to bite. And in the seconds before he hit send, before he could spin this into a legal threat or a smear, someone else did something that made the world tilt. Uncle Greg walked over to Eric, put a hand on his shoulder, and said, very quietly, "If you take this to a lawyer, you'll lose more than a cabin." Eric's phone slipped from his hand. He looked at Greg, at my father, at the neighbor crowd, at the notary who'd been watching like the law itself, and for the first time I saw doubt. Not the sharp doubt of calculation, but the ragged kind that comes when your web of conveniences collapses. He turned and walked toward his truck, slamming the door with a force that rattled the windows. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then my mom started to cry. Not the dramatic, well-practiced kind, but real tears. Those quick, hot things that come when someone realizes they've misjudged what they wanted. She wrapped her arms around herself and muttered, "We're family, we're family." Like a litany she could not undo. People started to gather chairs and plates. Conversations hummed. The issue hadn't been resolved. Far from it. But the framing had changed. What was once an attempt at a quiet, administrative reshuffle had become a communal conversation about fairness and belonging. The crowd's presence made certain moves risky for my parents and Eric. Publicity is a strange thing. Sometimes it protects, sometimes it punishes, but it always complicates the comfort of secrecy. I breathed in the smell of pine and coffee and pie and realized I'd crossed a line I hadn't been sure I would cross 2 days earlier. I'd turned a private grievance into a public stand. I felt the old, familiar ache that comes with family wounds. But underneath it was something else. A firm, cool satisfaction that I'd reclaimed a place that was never supposed to be a trophy. Just then, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number scrolled across the screen. We saw the posts. Want to help with the legal side? We have experience with deeds and elderly trusts. The message was short, to the point, and unsigned. I looked up. The smile that had been building inside me faltered only slightly. There were now, quietly, multiple fronts, neighbors and extended family on one side, the looming threat of lawsuits on the other. The next move would matter. I turned to Jenna. This has to be careful, I said. If they go legal, I don't want this to get ugly for anyone. She squeezed my hand. Then we do this right. I pulled out the deed again, feeling the paper between my fingers like a talisman. Around us, the yard buzzed with normal human things. Muffins, laughter, the clink of plates. But under it all, a complex chess game had begun. My parents and Eric could choose to escalate. They could also choose to repair things. Before they had a chance to decide, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from a number I recognized. Dad's lawyer, the one my parents had mentioned in a tone that had made my blood go cold. The porch fell into a hush as I answered. On the other end, a measured voice said, "Mr. Matthews, we've been retained by your parents. We need to speak." I listened, keeping my voice steady, then nodded at Jenna. "We'll listen. But know this. We have documents, witnesses, and a community that remembers Grandpa. If this goes to court, it won't be private." There was a pause on the line, a breath where someone recalculated. Then the voice said, "Understood. We'll be in touch." I hung up and looked out at the crowd. Friends, cousins, neighbors, the notary, even my father, who was talking quietly to Aunt June. The scene was fragile and beautiful and dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated. The revenge had begun not with a single explosive act, but with a slow accumulation of evidence, community, and the quiet courage to call things by their name. And yet, as the lawyer's number stilled in my phone, I felt the air tighten. This was no longer just about a weekend or a campfire photo. It was about legacy, about how families treat the promises left to them. It was about whether small acts of exclusion could be allowed to calcify into ownership. Eric reappeared at the edge of the yard, his face hard as flint. He walked up to my dad and whispered something that made my father's shoulders cave. My mother, who'd been drying her cheeks, looked suddenly like a woman who'd remembered an old command she could issue. I didn't have time to react because from the path down by the boathouse came the sound of a car door slamming, an unfamiliar cadence. Heads turned. Faces shifted. The next arrival was someone I hadn't expected, and their presence would change the math of the day in a way neither side had counted on. I took a breath, the kind you take before you open a letter that will change everything, and waited to see who'd stepped out of that car. The car by the boathouse was a sleek black SUV I didn't recognize at first, but as it pulled closer and the engine idled, I saw who was behind the wheel, my cousin Evelyn. She had always been subtle, the type who liked to watch chaos from the sidelines. But her expression this time was sharp, determined. She stepped out, tall and confident, a folder tucked under her arm. "Thought you could use some backup," she said, her voice even, but carrying weight. "And I mean in a legal sense. I've been looking into Mom and Eric's side. They've been shady with the cabin funds for years." The crowd stirred, murmuring. My parents looked as though they'd just been caught holding a loaded deck of cards. Eric's jaw tightened, and for once, the arrogance I'd come to expect from him faltered. Evelyn moved forward and handed the folder to me. Inside were copies of bank statements, invoices, and emails showing Mom and Eric had been funneling some of the cabin rental money into accounts not disclosed to the other heirs. It wasn't illegal, strictly speaking, but it was manipulation of the cabin's shared resources, and if ever reviewed publicly or legally, It would look bad, very bad. I looked up at them calmly. You've spent years pretending this cabin was only about Eric and Mom. The truth is everyone has a stake, and you've been trying to privatize it under the guise of practicality. The bookings I refunded? That was a reminder that the cabin isn't just yours to control. My mom opened her mouth, then closed it. Troy, you're overreacting. This is family. We can talk this through. No, I said firmly, letting the word hang in the air. This isn't a conversation anymore. You've already decided who deserves access, who is welcome, and who isn't. You've excluded us, hidden the bookings, and posted photos online as if none of this mattered. You've made your choices. I'm simply making mine. Eric's face turned red. You can't just. Yes, I can, I interrupted. I can protect my rights. I can enforce the clause Grandpa left in the deed. And I can make sure anyone who tries to manipulate this property like a trophy sees the consequences. He spun around, storming toward his truck. This isn't over. You'll regret. I didn't let him finish. I reached for my phone and sent the last of my scheduled notifications. The family celebration at Grandpa's cabin post, now live to the wider circle of neighbors, friends, and relatives. Comments started appearing almost immediately. Can't believe they tried to do that. We'll be there. Grandpa would have wanted it shared. Each notification, each affirmation from the community, made the hold Eric and Mom thought they had completely irrelevant. Mom tried to intervene, but Evelyn had anticipated that. She stepped between Mom and me, holding up a hand. You've had your turn, Evelyn said quietly. Now it's time to respect the agreement. The rest of the day passed like a controlled, unfolding drama. Neighbors and family arrived, helping set up chairs and tables. Aunt June served lemonade. Mara set the coffee out, and even Dad quietly helped arrange things without saying much. Eric tried to whisper and pull people aside, but nobody followed him. His influence evaporated in the face of the facts, the witnesses, and the community he'd ignored. By evening, the campfire was lit, not a private, exclusive gathering, but a real, shared one. My wife Jenna, Evelyn, and I sat together, watching the firelight dance across the faces of family and neighbors who were finally seeing the cabin for what it was meant to be, a place for everyone. Mom didn't speak to me directly all night. Eric kept to himself near the water, glaring occasionally but not daring to interfere. My father avoided eye contact but didn't try to stop anyone. It became clear that Mom and Eric's power had been broken, not by shouting, not by confrontation, but by carefully using the rules they thought they could bend and showing everyone what their choices revealed. By the end of the evening, the cabin was alive again in a way that hadn't happened in years. Laughter echoed across the lake. People shared stories of Grandpa, of summers long past, and of small victories over injustice. Mom and Eric were physically present but emotionally absent, isolated by their own entitlement and the choices they had made. I didn't forgive them, and I didn't pretend this restored any warmth between us. The cabin would now be managed transparently, with all heirs consulted for every decision. Any attempt to override the unanimous consent clause would be met with witnesses, legal documentation, and community accountability. My parents had shown their true colors. They were villains in a family drama of their own making, and now everyone could see it. As I looked out across the lake, the fire reflecting in my eyes, I realized something. Revenge isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about reclaiming what's yours and making sure the people who tried to steal it can never do so again. Mom and Eric could sulk, they could scheme, they could imagine that they still held sway, but the truth, the community, and the law were on my side. That night, as the cabin settled into quiet, with everyone else leaving or settling near the fire, I knew the balance had shifted. Not just for me, but for the generations to come. The cabin would remain a gift for all of us, not a prize for the entitled. And for once, the people who tried to manipulate, exclude, and control were the ones left watching as their plans burned quietly in the glow of a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The situation now was clear. I had regained control. Mom and Eric had lost the advantage they thought they had, and Grandpa's legacy was finally protected. They remained villains in the story, selfish, entitled, manipulative, and I had ensured everyone could see them for exactly what they were. There was no reconciliation, no forgiveness, just the quiet, permanent knowledge that their scheme had failed. And I smiled, because sometimes winning quietly is the sweetest revenge of all. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. I'm Billy, 27 now, but this story starts back when I had just turned 24, the birthday that changed everything. Growing up, my family wasn't the kind that celebrated milestones unless it benefited someone else. My mom had a way of twisting every occasion into a performance about her sacrifices. My dad went along with it, quiet but complicit, like a man who gave up trying to have his own opinions decades ago. Then there was my younger sister, Natalie, the self-appointed princess of the family who never had to ask twice for anything. Somehow, no matter what happened, I was always the one expected to understand, to help, to not make things about me. I used to think that was normal. I used to think being the good son meant being quiet about what I needed. But on my 24th birthday, I finally realized how deep that imbalance ran. That morning, I woke up to an empty kitchen table. No note, no card, not even a text. My family had always been hit or miss when it came to birthdays, but after a long, stressful week at work and months of saving for a small promotion celebration, I figured maybe this year would be different. I wasn't asking for much, just a nice dinner together. So around noon, I called my mom. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to sound casual. "I was thinking maybe we could do dinner tonight. Nothing fancy, just something small. It's been a while since we all sat down together." She paused for a few seconds, long enough for me to picture her frowning into the phone. "Dinner? Tonight?" "Yeah," I said. "It's my birthday. I thought it'd be nice." "Oh, right," she replied flatly. I completely forgot. Then came the sigh, the one she used whenever she wanted me to feel like I was inconveniencing her. "Billy, you know Natalie has her big presentation tomorrow, and I've been helping her prepare. She's been under a lot of stress. We can't just drop everything for a dinner." It was like she hadn't even heard what I said. I tried to keep my voice calm, but it came out softer than I intended. "It's just one night, Mom. We could do takeout at home if that's easier." "Stop making everything about you," she snapped. "You're old enough to handle a birthday without turning it into a production. Be grateful your sister's trying to make something of herself instead of demanding attention all the time." That sentence hit harder than she probably realized. I'd been working full-time since I was 19, 2 jobs through college, paying off student loans without a cent of help. Meanwhile, Natalie, 2 years younger than me, had never worked a day in her life. Yet somehow she was always trying, always under pressure, always the one worth adjusting the schedule for. "Mom," I said slowly, "it's not about taking attention. I just thought," she cut me off. "We'll see. But don't be dramatic, Billy. If we can't, we can't. You can celebrate another time." That was the moment something in me started to shift. I hung up, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at the half-made sandwich in front of me. I told myself I shouldn't be surprised. This was just how my family operated. But deep down, it hurt more than I wanted to admit. All I wanted was one dinner, one small acknowledgement that I mattered too. Around 6 that evening, I decided to go over anyway. I picked up a cake from the bakery, a small chocolate one with "Happy Birthday, Billy" written on top. It felt childish, like I was forcing a celebration that no one wanted to attend, but I couldn't help myself. I just needed to believe my family could do better. When I arrived, the house looked the same as always, immaculate but cold. The kind of clean that doesn't feel like home. My dad was in the living room watching TV, and Natalie was sitting on the couch surrounded by papers. No one even looked up when I walked in. "Hey," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "Thought we could do dinner together." My dad glanced over, expression unreadable. "Your mom's still out with Natalie's team. She said she'd grab food on the way back." "Oh," I said, trying not to sound disappointed. "Well, I brought a cake. We can still eat when she gets home." Natalie didn't even lift her eyes. "You really picked the worst day, Billy. I have to finalize my slides tonight." I wanted to laugh. It was always the worst day whenever it wasn't about her. But before I could respond, my mom came through the door carrying a takeout bag and talking loudly into her phone. She ended the call, glanced at me, and frowned. "Billy, what are you doing here?" I held up the cake. "I thought we could all have dinner together." She set the bag down, sighing. "Billy, I told you it's not a good time. You can't just show up expecting everyone to drop what they're doing." "I just wanted to celebrate with my family," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Stop," she said sharply. "You're too sensitive. It's one day. Not everything revolves around you." The words felt like ice water. My dad shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to stay out of it, and Natalie smirked like I was being ridiculous. That small, knowing smile, that's what broke me. I looked at the cake in my hands, then at my mom. You know what? You're right, I said quietly. Not everything revolves around me. I set the cake on the counter, grabbed my jacket, and walked toward the door. Billy, don't be childish, she called after me. You're overreacting again. I stopped in the doorway, turned around, and met her eyes. I'm not overreacting. I just finally get it. Then I left. That night, sitting alone in my car with the uneaten cake beside me, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't keep chasing scraps of acknowledgement from people who never wanted to give it. If they couldn't see my worth now, they'd see it one day, just not in the way they expected. Over the next year, I poured everything into my work. I took every extra project, every late-night shift. Slowly, things began to change. I started freelancing on the side, and by the time I turned 25, I'd built a small business from the ground up. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. I didn't tell my family about it. They'd only find a way to diminish it, to tell me it was just a hobby. They still called occasionally, usually when Natalie needed something or when Mom wanted to guilt me about not coming around more. I kept my distance. But as my business grew, so did a quiet, simmering sense of satisfaction. I wasn't rich, not yet, but for the first time, I was free. Then, about a year and a half later, something unexpected happened, something that pulled me right back into their orbit. It started with a phone call. Billy, my mom said, her voice unusually sweet. We've been meaning to talk. How about you come over for dinner this weekend? We miss you. It sounded innocent enough. But with my family, kindness always came with strings attached. And this time, those strings would unravel everything. When my mom called that day, her tone caught me completely off guard. She sounded cheerful, almost warm, and it had been months since we'd spoken beyond a few stiff texts about family updates. I didn't trust it for a second, but curiosity got the better of me. A part of me, the one that still wanted to believe they could change, thought maybe this was progress. Maybe she realized how much she'd hurt me that night. So I agreed. That Saturday, I drove over to my parents' house, though our family home didn't feel much like mine anymore. The place looked exactly the same, neat, overly polished, with not a single thing out of place. Even the smell was familiar, lemon cleaner, and the faint scent of my mom's perfume. It was strange how something could feel so familiar and foreign at the same time. When I walked in, Natalie was sitting at the table with my mom, surrounded by printouts and coffee cups. They both looked up at me, smiling in that forced, polite way people do when they've just been talking about you. My dad was in the living room again, half watching the news, pretending not to notice me. Billy, my mom said, standing up like I was some long-lost friend. Look at you. You've lost weight. Are you eating properly? I smiled faintly. I'm fine, Mom. Just been busy. Busy, huh? Natalie said without looking up from her notes. Doing what? Still working that, what was it again? Computer stuff? Her tone had that fake innocence she always used when she wanted to sound curious but really meant to belittle you. I just nodded. Yeah, business has been going well, actually. That's good, Mom said quickly before Natalie could reply. We're proud of you, honey. She gave me that bright, too wide smile. It didn't reach her eyes. Anyway, dinner's almost ready. We're having roast chicken, Natalie's favorite. Of course, I didn't even bother pointing it out. Dinner was tense, but civil at first. My mom asked surface-level questions about work, none of which she seemed to care about. Every time I mentioned something I'd accomplished, Natalie would find a way to twist it. When I told them I'd landed a few big clients, she leaned back and said, That's nice, but don't you get nervous depending on freelance work? I'd hate to be constantly worrying about where the next paycheck comes from. I just smiled tightly. It's actually pretty steady now. Mom nodded approvingly at Natalie instead of me. See, that's what I've always said. It's better to have something stable, like your sister's career path. She's planning ahead. I almost laughed out loud. Natalie had been planning ahead since she graduated, but as far as I knew, she still didn't have a real job, just a few internships my parents had pulled strings for. The rest of dinner followed the same pattern, me talking, them dismissing. But what really made my stomach tighten was when Mom brought up my absence from family gatherings. You know, Billy, your father and I have been worried, she began, cutting her chicken delicately. You've been so distant lately. It's not healthy to isolate yourself from family. I put my fork down. Mom, I've tried. It just didn't feel like anyone wanted me around. Oh, don't be dramatic, she said immediately. We all love you. You just have a habit of making things bigger than they are. I leaned back, forcing myself to stay calm. Like when I asked for a birthday dinner, and you told me to stop making everything about me? The table went silent. Natalie's fork paused midair. My mom didn't even blink. You're still holding on to that? She said, her voice flat. Billy, it's been years. We all have bad days. Sure, I said quietly. But your bad day became my memory of turning 24. Her eyes narrowed slightly, the way they always did when she realized she couldn't control the tone of the conversation anymore. You're too sensitive, she muttered, shaking her head. You always were. I felt the heat rise in my chest. And you always dismissed it when I tried to talk about it. Natalie sighed dramatically. Can we not do this right now? I have a big week ahead, and the last thing I need is a family argument. Mom immediately turned to her. You're right, honey. Billy, let's not ruin dinner. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but I didn't. I just nodded, quietly eating the rest of my food. After dinner, Mom insisted I stay for dessert, though the dessert turned out to be leftover store-bought brownies. While she made coffee, she suddenly shifted the tone, her voice light and sugary again. Billy, you've always been good with money, haven't you? There it was, the real reason for the invitation. I smiled faintly. I manage. Well, she said, glancing at Natalie, your sister's got an incredible opportunity coming up. A new project with her company. But she needs a little financial help to get started. Natalie gave me a hopeful smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's just a short-term loan, Billy. You know I'd pay you back. I almost choked on my coffee. You're asking me for money? Not asking, Mom corrected. We're just hoping you could support your sister like family does. We helped you so much when you were starting out. I blinked. You mean when you told me not to waste my time on my silly projects? Her lips pressed together. Billy, don't twist things. We gave you a home, food, and support. Isn't that what family's for? I stared at her. The nerve of it all, the revisionist history, the manipulation, made my hands shake. They had never supported my ambitions. If anything, they made them harder. Every time I tried to talk about what I was building, they'd laugh or change the subject to Natalie's latest achievement. I'm sorry, I said slowly, setting the cup down. But I can't do that. Natalie's face fell instantly, her voice softening into that pitiful, practiced tone she always used. Billy, it's just a few thousand. You probably make more than me anyway. It wouldn't even be a big deal. I shook my head. It's not about the money. It's about how you treat me. Every time I say no, it turns into me being selfish. But when you say no, everyone rushes to understand your side. My mom's smile vanished completely. You're being ungrateful. For what? I asked. For everything we've done for you, she snapped. Do you think you'd be where you are if it weren't for our support? I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. You're right. I wouldn't be. I'd be further ahead. For a moment, no one spoke. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension that had been building for years. My dad finally looked up from the couch, his voice tentative. Let's all calm down. But Mom wasn't done. You've changed, Billy. You used to be considerate. Now you're cold. You think money makes you better than your family. I exhaled slowly. No, Mom. I just think it lets me finally say no without you holding it over my head. Her jaw tightened, and Natalie crossed her arms. Wow, she said. All this because we forgot your birthday once. That's exactly the problem, I said, walking toward the door. You think it was about a birthday. It was about never maturing enough to be considered. Mom followed me to the entryway, her tone shifting again, soft, almost pleading. Don't go like this. We're family, Billy. Don't throw that away. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she wasn't pleading because she cared. She was pleading because she didn't want to lose control. I'm not throwing anything away, I said. I'm just done trying to hold it together by myself. And I left again. For weeks afterward, I didn't hear from them. Not a word. I thought maybe that was the end of it. I focused on my business, which had grown faster than I'd ever expected. I started hiring people, expanding, building something real. But then, a few months later, it happened again. A call, this time from my dad. Billy, he said awkwardly, your mom's been a little stressed. She feels bad about how things went. Maybe you could stop by this Sunday. No arguments, just family dinner. I almost said no. I should have. But curiosity, and maybe a shred of hope, won again. When I arrived that Sunday, everything felt off. The table was set more elaborately than usual, and both my parents were overly cheerful. Natalie wasn't there. For a moment, I actually thought this might be a genuine attempt at reconciliation. Until dessert. That's when Mom casually mentioned, "Your sister's moving into that new apartment we told you about. We're helping with the deposit, but it's been tight lately. If you could lend a hand, just this once, it would mean so much." There it was again, the pattern repeating like clockwork. But this time, I didn't argue. I just smiled and nodded, letting her believe I might help. I listened, I agreed, and I left quietly. Because I realized something that night. Arguing with them never changed anything. They didn't hear me when I spoke, only when I acted. It took a while, but eventually, I started to realize something crucial about my family. Their pleasantries were always transactional. Every smile, every invitation, every moment of apparent warmth came with a hidden price tag. And that realization hit hardest on a day I should have felt safe. The day I found out Natalie had betrayed me in a way I couldn't have imagined. It all started with a routine Monday morning at work. I was sitting in my small home office, scrolling through emails, sipping coffee, trying to ignore the faint ache of loneliness that had followed me since that birthday years ago. My business was growing steadily, clients were reliable, a few new projects were lined up, but I'd learned the hard way to be cautious with success. You can't let people see how well you're doing unless you're prepared for the envy that comes with it. And unfortunately, family envy is the worst kind, because they already know you inside and out. That morning, a message popped up on my client portal that immediately set off alarm bells. One of my larger clients, a company I'd been nurturing for over 6 months, had suddenly requested to terminate our contract. Their reason? Unforeseen internal issues. That's the professional explanation, at least. But something about it smelled off. I called my contact, trying to remain calm. "Is everything okay?" I asked politely. "We had everything scheduled for next week." "Oh, yes, everything's fine on our end," the client replied. "It's just a corporate policy thing. We had to switch providers for this quarter. Nothing personal." I thanked them, but I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my chest. I knew how businesses work, and this explanation didn't fit the timeline. We had already started preparing for the next project. Someone had undermined me. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my work. And the truth hit me like a punch. I remembered a conversation Natalie had slipped into months ago. She was casually asking about my clients, asking questions that seemed innocent at the time. I'd brushed it off, thinking she was curious, maybe even trying to show interest in my life. But suddenly, I saw it clearly. She'd been gathering information, my schedule, my client list, my contacts, and using it against me. I didn't confront her immediately. I needed proof. I started digging, tracing emails, checking logs. Within a few days, it became undeniable. Natalie had reached out to one of my clients directly, under the guise of offering industry advice, and had convinced them to terminate our agreement. The audacity of it made my stomach churn. This wasn't just jealousy. This was calculated, deliberate sabotage by the person who was supposed to be family. When I finally confronted her, I did it calmly, in front of my mom. I wanted them both to see exactly who she was and what they had allowed. "Natalie," I said, holding up the forwarded emails as evidence, "what is this?" She looked up from her phone, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about?" I slid the emails across the table. "You contacted my client. You undermined me. You made them terminate our contract. Do you even understand what that means?" Mom's face paled. "Billy, don't be ridiculous. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." "There's nothing reasonable about this." I snapped, my voice shaking. "You sabotaged me. You lied to me. You manipulated my clients behind my back." Natalie finally looked up, and in that moment, I saw the same arrogance and entitlement that had haunted me since childhood. She smirked. "Oh, come on. It's just business. You've been doing so well. It's not like you can't handle a little competition." I felt something in my chest tighten, like a balloon being squeezed. Competition? This is my livelihood. This is what I built from nothing. Mom finally spoke, her tone defensive, almost panicked. "Billy, you're overreacting. You know how your sister is. She didn't mean it like that. It was just a mistake." I laughed bitterly. "A mistake?" She deliberately went behind my back and destroyed months of work. "That's not a mistake, Mom. That's betrayal." Natalie shrugged. "You always take things too seriously. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with work, you'd understand family comes first." At that moment, The last thread of trust snapped. Everything I had believed about them, about family being a safe place, was a lie. They were more concerned about protecting Natalie, preserving her ego, than acknowledging the damage she'd done. My mom's attempts to minimize it, to brush it off as an accident, made it worse. I realized then that I could never rely on them to act fairly, to act with integrity, or even to act like family. I left that day in silence, walking out without another word. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it enraged me. Not the kind of rage that made you yell or cry, but the cold, simmering kind that fuels strategy. I spent the next few weeks quietly picking up the pieces. I resecured the clients I could, repaired relationships, and implemented safeguards to ensure nothing like this could happen again. But the damage to my trust had been done, and that was something I couldn't fix. For the first time in my life, I started thinking strategically, not just about my work, but about my family. I realized that if I ever let them back in without consequences, they'd never stop. They'd continue to manipulate, belittle, and sabotage me whenever it suited them. And Natalie, she had proven she was willing to cross every line, break every boundary, and destroy anything I worked for without a second thought. I started documenting everything: emails, texts, financial transactions. I kept meticulous records. Every slight, every manipulation, every outright betrayal was logged. I didn't want to react impulsively. I wanted to understand the full picture first. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, there would be no room for denial, no room for excuses. But that wasn't all. I also started investing quietly, putting my earnings into assets that my family had no idea about. Real estate, stocks, small ventures that would compound over time. I wanted to be untouchable. I wanted to build something so undeniable that my family, no matter how entitled or manipulative, couldn't twist the narrative against me. Meanwhile, they continued to show up in my life, trying to pretend nothing had happened. Mom would call, apologizing vaguely. "Billy, I'm sorry about the stress. We just want the best for you." Natalie would text, sending the occasional emoji-laden message like nothing had occurred. "Hey, hope work's going well." I didn't respond. I knew better. Their apologies were never sincere. They were testing the waters, seeing if I would forgive, if I would let my guard down. But I wasn't that naive anymore. Then, the final blow came, an act so calculated it made my stomach drop and my hands shake. Mom had managed to convince a small mutual acquaintance, someone I had trusted to advise me on an upcoming expansion, to feed them information about my business strategies. It was subtle, innocuous questions about market trends, casual mentions of my growth plans, but it was enough. Enough for them to start planting seeds of doubt in Natalie's mind. Enough for them to turn her envy into action. The day I discovered it, I felt the full weight of everything. Months of work, late nights, careful planning, and quiet victories had all been shadowed by their interference. They had once again inserted themselves into my life, attempting to manipulate outcomes to suit their own sense of entitlement. The betrayal wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. They wanted control, and they wanted to remind me that no matter how independent I thought I was, they still had the power to disrupt me. I sat in my office that night, staring at the documents and messages I had compiled. A single thought echoed in my mind. If they wanted to play dirty, so could I. But this time, I wouldn't react out of emotion. I wouldn't argue or plead or try to reason. I would plan. And when the time came, every slight, every manipulation, every betrayal would have a consequence they couldn't ignore. The thing about betrayal is that it changes you. It sharpens you. It makes you notice patterns you never saw before. And now, after Natalie's deliberate attack, after my mom's complicity, and after years of being dismissed, I finally understood something fundamental. Family doesn't automatically protect you. Sometimes, it's the enemy you know best. And enemies are best defeated when they least expect it. After Natalie's sabotage, I thought I had reached my breaking point. For the first time in years, I felt completely and utterly alone. It wasn't just the loss of a client or the financial setback. It was the realization that the people I had called family, the people I had trusted implicitly, were willing to undermine me at the slightest opportunity. And the worst part was the silence that followed. There were no apologies, no attempts to make amends, just the usual pretending everything was normal, as if I'd never existed that day. I went through that week in a haze. I didn't want to answer the phone, didn't want to see emails from anyone, Didn't even want to leave my apartment except to get groceries or coffee. My business was surviving, barely, but I felt hollow, like the foundation of my life had been pulled out from under me. My sleep was erratic. I'd wake up in the middle of the night replaying every conversation, every slight, every betrayal, thinking, how did I get here? How did I let this happen? It was a hard, dark period. I spent hours walking around the city at night, alone, replaying memories that had long been tucked away. I remembered my birthdays ignored, my achievements minimized, my opinions dismissed. I remembered Natalie being praised for mediocrity, mom and dad turning a blind eye to injustice, and me standing there, waiting for recognition that never came. And then, in one of those quiet, lonely nights, I realized something. I could either keep drowning in this bitterness, letting them control my emotions and define my worth, or I could use it. I could take that energy, that hurt, and turn it into something powerful. I couldn't control them, but I could control myself. I couldn't stop their envy or entitlement, but I could make sure it never harmed me again. So I started small. I doubled down on my work, not just to make money, but to regain confidence. I refused to engage with my family anymore unless it was necessary, and even then, I kept interactions strictly surface level. I focused on my clients, expanded my services, and slowly began to see results. I found a rhythm, a quiet satisfaction in building something that belonged solely to me, without interference from anyone else. At first, the progress was incremental. I landed a few new clients here and there, took on projects that stretched my abilities, and learned how to manage my time more effectively. I invested late nights in research, learning the nuances of business I'd only brushed over before. I started keeping meticulous records, tracking not just finances, but growth trends and client satisfaction. Each small success felt like a victory, a reminder that I was capable, even without their validation. As months passed, my business began to flourish. I hired a small team, people I trusted and respected, who understood my vision. I set up systems to prevent any manipulation from outsiders, knowing now how vulnerable I could be when I allowed others into my professional life. I was learning to build walls, literal and metaphorical, around my success. Meanwhile, my family continued their usual behaviors, oblivious to the fact that I had grown untouchable. My mom called occasionally, always under the guise of checking in, but I refused to engage beyond polite, brief responses. Natalie sent texts pretending to care about my business, asking innocuous questions, but I had long since stopped sharing anything meaningful. Every interaction was a reminder of the manipulation and betrayal, and I refused to give them that power again. The more I focused on myself, the more I realized how little I had depended on anyone. For years, I had let their opinions dictate my decisions, let their envy and favoritism shape my self-worth. Now I was free to make choices based on my own priorities, my own ambitions, my own values. I started investing in assets outside of the business, stocks, small real estate ventures, and other opportunities that would grow quietly without drawing attention. I built a financial cushion that made me feel secure, a safety net they could never touch. And as I grew stronger, I began to notice something interesting. Their behavior toward me started to shift, subtly at first. Mom's calls became more frequent, her tone gentler, though still calculating. Natalie started mentioning my projects in passing, casually asking questions that hinted at curiosity more than genuine concern. My dad, always the quiet one, started dropping subtle comments about my success when we crossed paths. I didn't respond. I didn't reward their attention. I let them exist on the periphery of my life while I continued to grow. I started setting boundaries that they couldn't push past, and every time they tried, I reinforced them calmly but firmly. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about proving to myself that I could stand independent of them, that I could thrive despite their toxicity. By the time my next birthday rolled around, things were drastically different. I didn't need their recognition or approval anymore. I celebrated quietly, with close friends and colleagues who genuinely cared about me, in a way that felt fulfilling. There were no dramas, no manipulations, no passive-aggressive remarks. I felt the first true sense of pride I had ever experienced, the knowledge that I had built something real on my own terms. And yet, beneath the calm and the success, a part of me remained alert. The betrayal had taught me a valuable lesson. You can't underestimate people who feel entitled. I kept my eyes open, my records meticulous, and my plans deliberate. I knew that eventually, there would be a moment when my family's envy would meet my power. When that moment came, I wanted to be ready, not reacting from emotion, but acting with strategy, precision, and the quiet satisfaction that only comes from being in control. For now, though, I continued the slow climb. I expanded my business into areas my family didn't know about, diversified my income, and reinforced my independence. Every day was a building block, every success a reminder that I no longer needed them to validate me. And the more I built, the more I realized the most powerful thing of all, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. Even when I saw them occasionally, Mom calling, Natalie sending messages, Dad making small comments, their words no longer had the power to wound me. I had transformed my anger and hurt into focus and growth. I had learned to trust myself, to rely only on those who had earned it, and to recognize that family, in the absence of respect, could never be more than an obstacle. The stage was set. I was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more patient than I had ever been. And now that I had reached this point, I knew what came next. I would make them see, not through arguments, not through pleas, but through undeniable proof. The proof of everything they had underestimated, every slight they had committed, every betrayal they had inflicted. And when that time came, they wouldn't be able to dismiss it, twist it, or pretend it didn't happen. They would finally understand the full measure of what they had lost. Over the next year, I quietly expanded my network, always careful not to tip my hand. I knew my family was watching, even if they didn't realize how closely. Mom's calls became more frequent. Natalie tried to casually inquire about my projects, and even my dad began mentioning me to friends, always underestimating what I was capable of. None of it mattered to me anymore. I had learned the art of patience. Revenge wasn't about snapping in the moment. It was about building leverage, quietly gaining power while they continued under the illusion that nothing had changed. It started with small opportunities, industry meetups, informal client gatherings, workshops I attended on weekends. At first, I went for the knowledge, learning things about the market I hadn't considered, emerging trends, gaps my competitors hadn't noticed, and ways to automate processes that would save me months of work. But the more I learned, the more I realized I could leverage this information to grow beyond my current level, to create a position where I would be untouchable. One evening, at a conference on digital business strategies, I struck up a conversation with a senior executive from a mid-sized company in my industry. He was impressed with my ideas and the way I had built my company from scratch. Over the course of the next few weeks, we exchanged emails, discussed strategies, and eventually met for a private consultation. That meeting was pivotal, not just because it brought me a major client, but because it taught me something I had underestimated: the power of alliances. People who respect your skills, who recognize your value, can become allies in ways your family never will. They can amplify your success instead of undermining it. I realized then that my family had always been my biggest obstacle, not just because of their interference, but because I had been operating on their terms. I had measured my worth according to their approval, which they had never given. To gain power, I had to step out of that system entirely. I needed to create influence that existed outside their perception, beyond their reach. I began investing in strategies that could put me in control of narratives. I diversified my business into complementary ventures, a small digital marketing agency, a boutique consulting firm, and a niche software tool I had been developing quietly for months. Each piece worked in concert, allowing me to expand my influence, increase my revenue, and create a network that relied solely on me. By the end of that year, I had contracts with multiple major clients, some of whom were household names in my field, and my business was beginning to scale at a rate I had never imagined possible. And then I discovered the tool that would give me a kind of leverage I hadn't anticipated. One of my new clients introduced me to a platform that tracked market influence, brand visibility, and potential acquisition opportunities. Using this platform, I could analyze competitors, identify weaknesses, and predict strategic moves. Essentially, it was a way to map out power dynamics in my industry, knowledge that could be used not just for business success, but for strategic advantage in any negotiation. I started testing it on small cases first, analyzing rival agencies, predicting client needs, and using the insights to offer better deals. Each success reinforced my confidence. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning to operate at a higher level, thinking several steps ahead. I realized that if I applied the same strategy to my family, I could turn the very tools they had used to belittle me into instruments of control. It was around this time that a more personal opportunity presented itself. I had a distant cousin, Marissa, who ran a small family-owned business. She was struggling to keep it afloat, and when I offered some guidance, she readily accepted. Over a series of months, I helped her restructure operations, improve marketing, and stabilize finances. In return, she shared insights into my family's finances, habits, and vulnerabilities. Through her, I discovered that mom and dad were relying heavily on inherited assets, using them to prop up Natalie's ventures while minimizing any investment in mine. I also learned that Natalie had been overextending herself in a few speculative projects, unaware of the full financial consequences, something I could exploit strategically later if needed. Armed with this knowledge, I realized something crucial. I didn't just have the power to protect myself anymore. I had the ability to influence outcomes in ways my family couldn't predict. I could quietly shift their world without them ever realizing I was orchestrating it. I could turn the envy, the entitlement, the manipulations they had wielded against me back on them, but in a way that would be undeniable, inescapable, and entirely under my control. At the same time, I began to build credibility in public spaces. I started giving talks at conferences, writing articles for industry publications, and sharing insights on digital platforms. My reputation grew not because I needed validation from my family, but because people recognized value in my work. I became someone with influence, someone who could command attention, not through theatrics, but through expertise. And through all of this, my family remained oblivious. They still attempted to insert themselves into my life in subtle ways. Mom would call under the guise of casual conversation, Natalie would make veiled comments about my success, and my dad would occasionally drop hints about keeping the family close. But I treated them as I treated any minor business competitor, observing, cataloging, and learning patterns without revealing my own hand. The turning point came when I realized the potential of what I had built. I wasn't just creating wealth. I was creating leverage, influence, and control. With the information I had gathered, the alliances I had formed, and the strategic position I had cultivated, I could orchestrate moves that would force my family to confront the reality of their actions. Not through confrontation, not through anger, but through undeniable evidence, influence, and the quiet application of power. By this point, I had reached a level of stability and influence that would have been unimaginable a few years earlier. My business was thriving, my reputation was solid, and my strategic position allowed me to think several steps ahead of anyone who might try to interfere, including my family. Every past slight, every betrayal, every manipulation became data points in a grander picture. I was no longer reactive. I was calculating. And the final realization hit me quietly one night, as I reviewed my growing portfolio and client base. I didn't just have the means to protect myself anymore. I had the tools, the information, and the strategic insight to turn every injustice, every slight, and every betrayal into leverage. My family had underestimated me for years. They thought I was too sensitive, too soft, too forgiving. They were wrong. The setup for what was to come wasn't just about revenge. It was about inevitability. I had built a position where I could move with precision, influence outcomes, and control the narrative entirely. And they would never see it coming. It was only a matter of time before the first piece fell into place. This is the part I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times without ever letting it go loud. Because a good plan doesn't need theatrics. It needs precision, timing, and the right audience. For months, I'd been cataloging everything. Emails, timestamps, bank trails, casual messages where my family tried to rewrite reality. I'd built allies, people who respected my work, and, more importantly, people who had power in places my family didn't even know existed. I didn't want to humiliate them in an angry, public spectacle. I wanted consequences that would fit the crimes: loss of credibility, loss of leverage, and the quiet collapse of the safety nets they'd relied on to keep their entitled life going. I started by lining up 3 things I knew would matter to them: credibility, cash, and reputation. For Natalie, credibility was everything. Her career advancement depended on a string of endorsements and a fragile investor who adored her vision. For Mom, Reputation was the currency she circulated at school fundraisers and neighborhood gatherings. For both of them, a hint that they couldn't be trusted would force them to scramble. And scramble is the moment when people make mistakes. I invited them to what they thought was a belated birthday dinner. Again, and this time they took the bait eagerly. Mom was all warmth and "we can finally be a family" lines, like she'd rehearsed a role. Natalie arrived with her usual practice brightness and a new portfolio she couldn't wait to show me. They were smug in the way only people who've never had to fight for respect can be. What they didn't know was that dinner wasn't the event. The event happened the next day, privately, with 4 people they never expected to be in the same room. I'd spent months building relationships with industry people who respected my work and with a couple of key figures who could make or break small ventures. Marissa, the cousin I'd quietly helped, an executive from the firm that had been my big client, and a small-time investor who'd been considering backing Natalie's next big thing. I asked them to meet for coffee on the pretense of discussing industry trends. I gave them a curated packet, anonymized at first, about how certain family dynamics can poison small businesses and ruin reputations, and then I let the facts speak. The packet was surgical. It included the emails where Natalie reached out to my clients, screenshots of the messages where Mom tried to gaslight me into forgiving and forgetting, transaction records showing how family funds had shuffled under the guise of support, and a timeline that tied actions to consequences. Nothing personal, no grandstanding, no screaming. Just evidence, laid out like a brief. I made sure every item had a corroborating contact. Marissa could attest to the financial shuffles. The executive could confirm that Natalie had been in contact with their procurement team, and the investor could show how he'd pulled preliminary interest after seeing the pattern of instability. When I first sent the packet, they read it silently. Then, one by one, they nodded. The atmosphere was clinical, the kind you find in rooms where contracts are decided. The investor called his associate. The executive made a note and said he'd adjust their vendor list. Marissa said she'd go back to her family with a financial reality check. That was all I needed. These were dominoes that toppled quietly and efficiently. I didn't revel in the moment. I walked into the meeting like someone who'd come to work, because that's what it was, work to correct a long injustice. But the effects were immediate. Within days, Natalie's potential investor withdrew his interest with a formal email citing concerns about governance and transparency. The executive publicly changed a vendor relationship that indirectly affected a separate opportunity Natalie had been courting. Marissa confronted Mom with the spreadsheets she'd shared, and Mom's practiced responses faltered when an outside voice started asking direct questions she couldn't smooth over with charm. The real payoff, though, was subtler and sweeter. Instead of screaming and pointing, I let other people's decisions do the talking. Reputation, once gone, doesn't come back with apologies. The kind of people who host gala tables and endorse neighbors don't like uncertainty. Once a whisper of doubt started circulating among people who mattered to them, the invitations thinned, the whispered endorsements vanished, and the pedestal they'd stood on for years began to wobble. When I finally saw them together, Mom pale and defensive, Natalie flustered, and suddenly human in a way I'd never seen. Something unexpected happened inside me. There was relief, yes, but it wasn't the vicious satisfaction I'd once imagined. It was the quiet closure of a ledger finally balanced. I hadn't sought to destroy them. I wanted them to feel the same uncomfortable accountability they'd so often flung at me. I wanted the scales to tip long enough for them to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end. That said, I didn't stop there. I took steps to protect myself further. I formalized agreements, tightened contracts, installed redundancies, and made sure the next time someone tried to sabotage me, there would be legal and professional consequences that couldn't be explained away with family disagreements. I also made one more move that felt, at the time, surgical and inevitable. I quietly acquired a small stake in a property their side business relied on, not to ruin them, but to ensure they couldn't leverage the same shaky foundations against me again. The fallout was immediate and messy for them. My inbox filled with messages from people I barely knew, thanking me for bringing issues to light. My public reputation, built slowly and honestly, grew stronger because I'd shown competence and restraint. My private life felt lighter because the people who'd once weaponized my kindness now had to reckon with consequences in spaces where their charm didn't work. But here's the part one won't tidy up for you yet. As the first wave of consequences hit, they didn't just fold gracefully. Entitlement doesn't disappear quietly. It lashes out. Mom called twice, once with a plea that sounded like grief, the next time with thinly veiled accusations. Natalie made a public attempt to paint herself as a victim of gossip. And in the middle of that scramble, a new, unexpected variable appeared. One that I hadn't planned for, and that pulled me back into something I thought I'd already closed. I sat there, watching the dominoes fall, feeling that old mix of vindication and unease. I had executed the plan cleanly and professionally. It worked. But the new variable, someone else's reaction, someone neither of us had anticipated, was already starting to ripple, and it promised to change the game in a way I hadn't accounted for. The weeks following my quiet execution of the plan were surreal. I watched the fallout unfold like a storm I had orchestrated but didn't need to micromanage. Natalie's investor didn't just withdraw. He publicly announced a shift in priorities, citing due diligence concerns, and the news spread in the niche industry circles they relied on. Any potential project Natalie had lined up began to evaporate quietly. The partners she had bragged about for months no longer returned her calls. For someone who had built their ego entirely on external validation, it was devastating. Mom's reaction was slower, but no less telling. She tried her usual tactics: calls, texts, half-hearted apologies, hints about family bonds. But this time, every attempt bounced back against her. Marissa had compiled the records I'd shared into a clear, irrefutable summary, showing how funds were being mismanaged and how past manipulations had consistently harmed me while propping up Natalie. Neighbors and friends, previously swayed by Mom's charm, began asking pointed questions. Invitations that once flowed effortlessly now became scarce. Mom, for the first time, experienced the quiet social isolation she had inflicted on me emotionally for years. Even Dad couldn't maneuver his way out. A few of his business contacts, quietly informed of patterns of interference and favoritism, began to reconsider partnerships. Where he had once been able to lean on authority and history, now every move was scrutinized, and he realized too late that the credibility he had assumed as a birthright was gone. Meanwhile, I continued my life in stark contrast, growing my business, expanding my network, and nurturing partnerships that were built on competence and integrity rather than entitlement. Each meeting, each contract, each client interaction reminded me that I no longer needed approval from the people who had so often dismissed me. I could measure success on my own terms. The most satisfying moments, though, were subtle, the ones that no one else saw but me. The look on Natalie's face when she realized her credibility was collapsing, the slight falter in Mom's voice when she couldn't charm her way out of questions, the way Dad paused mid-sentence when someone outside the family referenced the truth about their past decisions. These were small, quiet victories, but they cut deeper than any dramatic confrontation ever could. I didn't gloat. I didn't call them out publicly. I let the systems I had built and the people I had quietly informed do the work. It was a lesson in power. The most effective revenge is the one that doesn't require your presence to succeed. I had orchestrated outcomes that were both inevitable and irrevocable. The trust they had shattered in me was returned in the form of accountability, and for the first time, they experienced a fraction of the disempowerment they had inflicted. Months later, I looked back at everything: the manipulations, the betrayals, the long years of being dismissed, and I felt a sense of closure that was profound. Not because I had destroyed anyone, but because I had reclaimed my own narrative. I had taken what was once a source of pain and turned it into a foundation for strength. I had proven to myself that no one, not family, not envy, not entitlement, could dictate my worth. The final, quiet affirmation came one morning when I received a text from an acquaintance in the industry. "Your reputation is solid. You've handled everything flawlessly." I smiled at my phone, knowing it wasn't just about reputation. It was about freedom. I had risen above the chaos they created, and their own actions had done more to diminish them than any argument ever could. As I closed my laptop that morning, sipping my coffee in the quiet of my home, I realized something that I hadn't allowed myself to believe for a long time. I was finally untouchable, not because I was perfect, but because I had learned to build power from patience, intelligence, and resilience. And in that calm, powerful moment, I finally felt what I had been chasing all these years. Not revenge, not recognition, but peace, and the unshakable knowledge that I had emerged victorious on my own terms. The ledger was balanced, the lessons were learned, and for the first time, I was truly free.